hello to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. As Matt said, apologies, but Matt Ellman, who was delivering the first webinar today, is unavailable. So I've stepped in. I'm still going to focus on speaking skills, but I'm not doing Matt's session. I'm doing a session of my own, so I hope that's okay with everybody. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Peter Lucantoni. That's an Italian surname. My dad was Italian, my mum is English. I was born in the UK and educated there. I've been in the ELT business all my life as a teacher, like many of you, as a school manager, obviously as a teacher trainer, as an author. I write books for Cambridge University Press. And I currently work as professional learning and development manager for Cambridge University Press in the Middle East and North Africa. So what I'm going to do this morning, or this afternoon, or this evening, or depending on where you are, is try and address these 5 main points, which to have a little think about what the experts in the field say about speaking as a skill. And we're then going to have a look at 2 terms which I'm sure you're very, very familiar with, and possibly terms which you agonize over, which is right, which is wrong, should I do this or should I do that, accuracy or fluency. We're also going to have a look at what speaking actually involves from 2 different perspectives. And I'm going to show you an activity called reciprocal speaking and listening. And we're going to end up with, again, an age-old question. And there's no way we'll have any time to come to any conclusions about that question. But should our students be using any of their first language, their home language, in the classroom? So that's what we're going to do in the next hour or so. Please, if you have questions about certificates and last week's webinars, we will deal with all of that at the end. So please just use the chat box to respond to any points that I put on the screen. Okay, so first of all, let's just have a think about speaking and how challenging or not challenging it is compared to all of the other skills, listening, reading, and writing. I think there is very often from us, the teachers, an assumption that students will just walk into a classroom and be able to speak to some particular level. But I think we would all agree that speaking is far more difficult than that. And this gentleman here, who I'm sure you will recognize and possibly remember him from my webinar last week, this is Jack Richards. And Jack Richards is there because he said this. He said that the ability to speak a second language well is actually a very, very complex task. There are many different things involved in being able to speak a second or even a third or a fourth language, as I know many of you are able to do. It's actually a very, very complex task. And in terms of teaching, this complexity obviously translates or transfers itself across to what we're trying to do in the classroom. And Chris Candlin, who you may have come across, this gentleman here, Chris Candlin says that when we try to get our students to actually talk in the classroom, it's probably one of the most challenging things that we have to do. He says getting students to talk is the major and one of the most difficult tasks confronting any teacher. And one more person I'd like to bring to your attention as a way into this particular webinar this morning is this gentleman here. This is Paul Seligson, who's written an enormous amount of resources, course books, with a great deal of focus on speaking and indeed listening skills. And he talks about our expectations of teachers and indeed the expectations of students. How high are we actually trying, not how high, but what level are we trying for our students to achieve? And he says this: very few students will become fluent speakers, but they can probably speak more than they do now, and they can easily be made to feel more comfortable. So going back to my point when I introduced Paul Seligson as another expert, I think very often our expectations of students are way too high, and this having such a high expectation often results just in everybody being demotivated and upset by the fact that students don't actually reach these particular goals. If we were to lower our expectations, lower our goals, this might enable our students to speak more than they actually do, and possibly even feel more comfortable in their efforts. Somebody's saying there's no video. There isn't any video. It's just you can hear me and you can see the PowerPoint slides, but there's no video. Okay, now Paul Seligson, he mentions this word fluent, obviously fluency, which brings me to the next part of what I wanted to talk to you about this morning, is this dilemma of accuracy versus fluency. I guess what we really want is for our students to be both accurate and fluent in their language use, but probably more important than either of those is communication and how we can help our students to be communicative. And it's probably true that both accuracy and fluency are essential elements in being communicative. And we'll see this word communication and communicative coming up in the next few things I want to talk to you about. So Hemmings says that ultimately we want our students to be successful language users. I don't think any of us would argue with that. We want them to be able to communicate in any situation. We want them to be able to communicate with full comprehension. We want them to be confident, and we want them to be effective in their adopted language. Now, possibly these expectations are far too high, but he does begin by saying ultimately that would be our final goal, if you wish, that we want our students to be successful and able to communicate in any situation with full comprehension. But in order to do that, of course, in order to reach that particular goal where students can communicate pretty much everywhere, then of course they're going to have to be fluent in their communication and accuracy in the type of language which they actually choose. So this is not about should it be accurate or should it be fluent. It's not the argument of accuracy versus fluency. Hemmings says that it's not an either or situation, it's both. In other words, if we want our students to be successful language users, if we want them to be able to communicate in any situation, if we want them to be able to communicate with full comprehension and to be confident about their spoken language and effective, and to have fluency, and of course to be accurate in their language choice, then both of those terms are important, the accuracy and the fluency. Only if we focus on both of those elements of spoken language are students ultimately going to be successful language users. Okay, so this lady here, who you may recognize. Anybody know who this is? Quickly type an answer into the chat box. Anybody know who it is? Yes, it's Penny Ur. Yeah, Penny Ur. And she points out that if we are teaching students about fluency and putting the accuracy to one side, then that's a great threat to spoken language proficiency. So she says students learning fluency without accuracy is one of the biggest threats. You can't do one without the other. You've got to be providing opportunities for students to practice both elements in the classroom. And Jack Richards, who we've come across today already, but we also talked or also used his words last year, he makes the point that it's only through communication, it's only through communicating in a language that students will develop their skills and become more proficient. And he points out that in communicative language teaching, which of course Jack Richards has written about extensively, he says that both fluency and accuracy are the goals. So people learn a language best when using it to do things. And again, we made this point in last week's webinar when we talked about strategies and how we actually learn. We talked about doing things. So both accuracy and fluency are the goals of communicative language teaching. And he goes on to say three very important things. He says, Jack Richards says, that teachers need to use fluency activities in order to support accuracy activities, and the other way around, and vice versa. So we can use a fluency activity in order to promote accuracy, and we can use an accuracy activity in order to promote fluency. And we'll look at in detail about what those two terms mean in just a moment. The second point he makes is that if we're going to focus on accuracy, we need to decide when in a particular lesson it's actually going to happen. And Jack Richards points out that accuracy work can either come before or after some sort of fluency practice. So we can focus on vocabulary pronunciation, we can focus on the correct use of a particular structure. That can happen before the students do their fluency activity, or it can come after they've done the activity as a way of giving them feedback on areas of their spoken language. The third point that Jack Richards points out is that if we're going to include fluency work in the classroom, then it can, from the teacher's side, actually involve a little bit more preparation, and as with many things we do, it needs feedback. We've got to give our students feedback on the type of language which they're using during the speaking activity. Let's not be too concerned though, just because something requires extra preparation doesn't necessarily mean it's a lot of hard work. I think what we have to do is think of this as a balancing act. It may require a little bit more preparation, but what are the benefits for the students? What do they actually get out of it? And I want to sort of round up what we're saying here about fluency and accuracy by mentioning Paul Nation, who I'm sure many of you have come across. And he points out three things about fluency activities. And I'm going to put the three things on the screen. And I've taken out one word from each of the three things that he says. And I'll just give you an opportunity to guess what you think the missing words actually are. So here's the first one. All language items involved are already what to the students? So we're talking about fluency activities. If we want to promote fluency, according to Paul Nation, all the language which the students are supposed to be using are already what to the students? And I can see known and I can see familiar. So we've got some great answers. Excellent, good. The second point that he makes is the focus of the activity, the focus of the fluency activity is on what, not form, in real time. What do you think he says for the second one? Meaning, communication, I can see familiar was the first one, communication usage. Okay, great, lovely. And then the third one, what are in place to outperform their normal proficiency? And in this particular phrase, there means the students. So what are in place to outperform the students' normal proficiency? So we're talking about what we need in a fluency activity. Okay, a bit more difficult, the third one, I think. Understanding, okay. Let's have a look at what he said. Here are the three answers. So the first one, all language items involved are already familiar to the students. Imagine if something is not familiar to the students, how on earth are they going to be able to actually participate in a fluency activity? If students are constantly searching or not knowing particular vocabulary items, then they're going to struggle, and it certainly will not be they won't be showing any signs of fluency. The second one from Paul Nation, the focus is on communication, not form, in real time. In other words, the students' task is to communicate with each other, not to worry about the form and the accuracy of it. And so the third one, and the missing word was the first word, Paul Nation says that supports are in place to outperform their normal proficiency. what he means here by supports is of course scaffolding. In other words, the teacher provides support, supplies scaffolding, which will help the students to go above their normal proficiency by providing them with possibly input through various resources, maybe through a picture or something that they read. All of this will scaffold the language which is being used in that particular activity. And to round this up, he mentions 6 key aspects of a fluency activity. So we're going to play a game. I'm going to give you the first letter. You need to think of what the 6 things are. So here's the first one. It begins with P. The activity needs to be what? Beginning with P, very quick. You've got 10 seconds. Word beginning with P, the activity needs, I can see precise, plan, practice. Okay, the answer is practical. And we'll see what that means in just a minute. Second one begins with F. The activity needs to be what? Any guesses? Fluent, nice idea. Fun, yeah. But just because it's fun doesn't mean that students are learning necessarily. F-O, focus, somebody got it. Iman, well done. Okay, there we go, focus. The third one, another P. P-R-E for this one, P-R-E. P-R-E, precise, very nice, good. Yeah, P-R-E. Okay, this one is predictable. As I said, we'll look at what these things mean in just a minute. The fourth one is N. The activity needs to be something beginning with N. Natural, very good. Who was that? It's already disappeared. Okay, a couple of you have got natural, very good. The fifth one, a bit more difficult, something beginning with G. The activity needs to be G. Any ideas? Genuine, nice idea. Yeah. Yeah. Haven't quite seen the word yet. G-E-N. Generative. But as I said, we'll see what it means in a minute. And the last one that he mentions is the activity needs to be V. Something beginning with V. Visual, nice idea. Yeah, valid. Okay, great, good. Okay, it's actually versatile. So let's have a look at what all those terms mean now. I'm going to put a very short definition of each one on the screen. They're all jumbled up, so you need to match the 6 definitions, A, B, C, D, E, F. Here they are. You need to match those to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I'll give you 60 seconds. You don't need to write your answers in the chat box because it will take too long. But I'll give you about 60 seconds and maybe you can write on a piece of paper what you think the answers are. No, you don't need to put them in the textbooks. Don't worry, because we haven't got time to check them. You don't need to put them in the textbooks. Just write them on a piece of paper, not in the textbooks. Another 20 seconds or so. Okay, so when we talk about a practical activity, by the way, thank you for all your answers, but I really didn't want them typed in the chat box because it's impossible to check. But if an activity is practical, then it probably means that it's B. In other words, the activity needs to be easy to set up and easy to manage. We don't want to be spending hours and hours and hours preparing for an activity, setting up an activity, managing an activity, which actually only takes couple of minutes, 5 minutes in the classroom itself. So make sure that the activity is practical, that it's easy for you to set up and manage. The second one, focused. Let's make sure the activity has a purpose. What's the outcome? What's the goal What are the students doing the activity for? Is it meaningless? Is it mechanical? Or does it actually have a real communicative purpose for the students? And of course, linked in with that, it's really very, very important that the students know what the purpose of the activity is. Don't keep it a secret. Let the students know what the purpose of the activity actually is. Number three, predictable, is that the language in the actual activity can be anticipated. In other words, as Nation said earlier, the language should be language which is already known, already familiar to the students. We shouldn't be asking them to do fluency activities if they don't know the language which we want them to actually use in the activity. For number four, natural, here we're talking about the actual language which is used. We want the language, we want to encourage students to use natural language. We're not talking about slang, we're talking about language which is naturally used, both inside and outside the classroom. Number five is important because I hear very often from teachers that speaking activities don't work well, students don't speak in English, they get bored, etc., etc. There are many complaints from teachers, but the important thing about an activity, a speaking activity, it needs to be generative. In other words, it needs to produce lots of language, 5F. A generative fluency activity will produce lots of language, but if the students are unclear about what it is that they're supposed to be doing, if they don't have scaffolding, if they don't have support, if the activity is too difficult for them, etc., then of course it's not going to produce lots of language. So we, the teachers, need to spend a lot of time thinking about the management of the activity and what we're doing to support the the students. And of course the last one, 6, it must be 6A. In other words, we want the activity to be versatile so that we can actually use it for other levels. Again, teachers, you're all very busy. None of us have a lot of time to be doing loads and loads of preparation. So if you come up with a great idea for an activity, make sure there's a degree of versatility in it so that you can actually use it with other levels. Okay, let's have a think now about what speaking actually involves. And I want to show you something which this lady said. This is Kang Schumann. Hope I've pronounced her name correctly. And Kang Schumann says that when you're learning a language, another language, whether it's your L1 or your L2, it's not just about knowing the grammar and knowing the semantic rules, in other words, the meanings of particular words. She says that there's a lot more to learning to speak a foreign language, as she calls it, than just knowing its grammatical and semantic rules. So what we're going to do now is look at what those things are. And she actually identifies 5 aspects, if you like, of learning to speak a foreign language. 5 things which she says are particularly important. So I thought we would do this by, I'll show you some pictures, and for each picture you can type into the chat box what you think the picture represents. Remember, we're thinking about what Kang Schumann said. Learning to speak a foreign language requires more than knowing its grammatical and semantic rules. So the pictures are going to show us what she thinks the other things are. So here we go. Here's the first one. Any ideas? What do you think that picture is showing us? What's the man in the picture doing? What's he trying to do? He's thinking, yeah, he's thinking about what? What's he thinking about? Okay, let me go back. Just reminding you of what Kang Schumann says. Learning to speak a foreign language requires more than knowing its grammatical and semantic rules. So we need to think about what to begin with. What do we need to think about? I'm getting some very lovely answers. Not quite what I'm looking for yet. Don't worry, we'll come back to it in a second. I think this guy is scratching his head. When we're scratching our head, we're thinking. He's thinking about words. Yep, he's thinking about the words that he actually needs in order to speak. Great, good. Okay, second picture. Now what happens next? He's remembered, he's recalled the words. Now what? What about the second picture? Thinking about the structure. That's good, Ashraf, but the structure of what? Structure. Yeah, quite a few of you are saying structure, but the structure of what? How to structure the sentence, somebody's saying. Great, yeah, good. Okay, so in our first picture, the guy is scratching his head. He's trying to remember some words. And now in the second picture, he's thinking about how to structure the words, how to organize those particular words. Very, very good. And now in my third picture, what does that represent? What does the third picture represent? So we've got remembering the words, we've got organizing the words. What's the third one? Okay, my third one, I don't think anybody's really getting my third one. The third one is trying to show that we need to use our lips and our tongue and our mouth in general in order to form sounds. And then the fourth one. Okay, we've got pronunciation, but I think pronunciation is actually number 3. We've done that. Pronunciation comes in number 3. The fourth picture is slightly different. Notice we've got an ear which is listening. We've got the phonemic script, and we're talking about the skills that somebody needs in order to speak. Well, production is the third one. Using the words is the third one. So what do we need to do when we speak? We have an ear and we have some phonemic symbols. Okay, number 4, what I'm trying to show you is that when we speak, we need to listen to ourselves. We need to monitor the sounds which are coming out of our mouth. And possibly we need to correct ourselves if we've made some mistakes. And the 5th one, which Kang Schumann mentions, is this one. Any ideas? What do you think my 5th picture is showing? I think a lot of you are still on the 4th picture. What about the 5th picture? What's the 5th picture trying to show? I've got lots of flags here. Different nationalities, different cultures maybe. Okay, so Kang Schumann says that first of all, we need to be able to recall the words. I've got lots of words in my head. Can I remember them all? Do I know which particular words I need for this particular situation, for this particular speaking task that I'm involved in? Have I actually got the right? I need to dig out those particular words. And once I've got the words, I then need to organize the words into units, maybe into chunks, maybe into idioms, whatever it might be. So yes, I've got the words and I've actually organized them. And now, thirdly, I need to move my lips and tongue in order to form sounds. Now we know that different languages have different sounds. Some sounds exist in one language which don't exist in another language, and vice versa. So we know that it's important that as teachers, we spend time on helping our students to move their lips and tongue in order to form the correct sounds. And once that's happened, once the speaker has moved their lips and tongue in order to form a sound, they need to monitor. Do you ever do this in your first or strong, proficient second language? You say something and immediately realize that you've said it incorrectly, and you backtrack and you say it again. Maybe you've slipped up with your pronunciation. So we need to be constantly monitoring what we're saying and correcting it if necessary. And the 5th thing that Kang Schumann mentions is that once all of this is in place, once we've remembered the important, appropriate words, and once we've organized them into some sort of sensible structure, and we've moved our lips and tongue and we've monitored, we also need, of course, all the time to be very, very aware of cultural conventions. Maybe this word or this phrase is not as appropriate in this culture as it might be in another one. So Kang Schumann, remember her earlier quote, she said that learning to speak a foreign language requires more than just knowing about its grammar and about the meanings of words. It's not enough just to know the grammar and the words. We also need to be able to do the 5 things that are on the screen at the moment. But of course, beyond that, there are other things that we need to be aware of as a speaker. And I'm only going to mention this briefly now because I'll be talking more about it on Tuesday next week in the final webinar in this series when I'll be talking about oracy, which will include a discussion about speaking and listening. But she also mentions 4 more things. The first of which is this: we need to know when it's appropriate to speak, to interrupt, to ask a question. In other words, the sub skills, if you like, of speaking and indeed listening, knowing when it's my turn to speak and knowing when I can actually ask a question. And she also mentions the ability to be able to negotiate and to be able to manage an exchange with another person or with other people. She refers also to intelligible pronunciation. You may have the most accurate and fluent language, but if your pronunciation is not clear for whatever reason, then obviously the communication is going to break down. And she mentions, very importantly, that we need to be able to select the right grammar and the right vocabulary for the particular context which we're in. Okay, I'd like now to introduce you to an activity which you might like to think about for using in your classrooms. You can also do this as an online activity using breakout rooms or chat rooms with your students. But you'll notice the title is Reciprocal Speaking and Listening. Now, when we reciprocate, when something is reciprocal, it means there's some sort of backwards and forwards going on between 2 people. If you reciprocate a present, then you give somebody a present in return for the one they gave you. So it's a backwards and forwards communication. And in this particular activity that I'm going to show you, the students in a class, in a group, they actually become the teachers within subgroups within the class during a lesson which could be focusing on speaking, or it could be focusing on listening. And the teacher needs to first of all model the activity, and then of course our job is to guide students using 4 different strategies. So how does this work? Students probably will be working in groups of 4, and in their groups each student takes on a role, and the 4 roles are these: the summarizing role, the questioning role, the clarifying role, the predicting role. Now, I said in groups of 4. You could do this in pairs, with each student taking 2 of the 4 roles in red on the right. So student number 1 could do summarizing and questioning, and student number 2 could do clarifying and predicting. There are different ways that you could set this up depending on the numbers of students that you have. But each student is going to take on one of those particular roles. So what do the roles involve? Well, the summarizer will highlight key ideas. Now, in a minute, you're going to listen to something, and the summarizer will highlight the key ideas from what they've heard. The questioner can ask questions about what they've heard. The clarifier can answer the questions from the questioner and can also clear up any confusions, any problems. And finally, the predictor will predict what they think is going to come next. So this can be done either with a reading text or with a listening text. It depends what the purpose of the lesson is, where you are in the course book, what you actually want to do, etc., etc. So there are different ways that you can actually approach this. So let's actually do the activity. So what I'd like you to do, you're going to listen to part of a listening text from a Cambridge University Press course, which is called English Unlimited Special Edition. And as you listen, I'd like you to engage with your role and either summarize, question, clarify, or predict. Now, obviously, there are a lot of people with us today, and I think we've got 2,800 of you are listening into this webinar. It's impossible for me to allocate roles. So I just want you to choose. Please do not put it in the chat box, but just choose for yourself. What do you want to do? Do you want to summarize? Do you want to question? Do you want to clarify? Or do you want to predict? And I'll just go back to the previous screen so you can see what they are. Just choose one of those for yourself. It doesn't matter which one you choose, but just choose one. Do you want to be summarizer, questioner, clarifier, or predictor? Okay. And now I'm going to read the listening text from the course. And as you listen, engage with your role. So if you're the summarizer, your job will be to summarize what you hear me say. If you're the questioner, your job is to come up with a question relevant to what you've heard. If you're the clarifier, you need to either answer the questioner's question or clarify something which is confusing. And if you're the predictor, you need to try and guess what you think is coming next. Now, as I said, in the classroom or with a small number of students in different breakout rooms or chat rooms, this would be easier to manage, but we've got nearly 3,000 of you. But I just want to give you an idea of how it works. So I'm now going to read the text, and as I read, just engage with your role. So here we are. It's very, very short, just a couple of sentences. Here we go. Well, I was in my car in the Rocky Mountains in Canada, and I was on a highway with lots of beautiful mountains and trees nearby. It was a sunny day and everything was perfect. Okay, that's the text. I'm going to read it just a second time so you can really engage with your role. Here we go. Well, I was in my car in the Rocky Mountains in Canada, and I was on a highway with lots of beautiful mountains and trees nearby. It was a sunny day and everything was perfect. So the students will listen to that, or they could be reading it from a course book, but let's say that this was for listening. And students now, in their role, they either summarize, they question, they clarify, or they predict. Now, we can't obviously get answers from everybody. It's impossible to monitor everybody, but I can see some of you are writing questions. No need, please, to write questions in the chat box. We don't have time to do it. But just as an example, the summarizer may say this. It took place in the Rocky Mountains in Canada, and it was a sunny day. That might be the summarizer's summary of what they've heard. The questioner might say, was she alone, the person? What's the highway? So it could be something about the context, or it could be checking the meaning of an individual word. So the clarifier's job now is to answer those two questions. So for example, was she alone? We don't know. What's a highway? It's a type of road. And the predictor might predict that in the next part of what we're going to hear, there's a change in the weather, or maybe there's going to be a surprise. So I'm going to quickly now show you what you've just heard. There it is. And now we tell the students, okay, you're going to listen to the second part of the listening text. And as you listen, engage with your new role. So the second time, the students can change roles or they can stay with the same role. So if you were summarizing the first time, you could change to predictor this time. If you were the questioner the first time, you could change to being the clarifier this time. So it's entirely up to you as the teacher. You can either ask your students to keep with the same role, or you can get them to change to a different role, depending on how you actually want to do it. So now I'm going to read you the second part. So this continues on from the first part. Here we go. Suddenly, I saw a family of bears, a mother bear and 2 cubs, near the side of the road. I love bears. So I stopped the car, I got out, and I started taking photos. I wasn't very close to the bears, but the cubs got frightened and the mother looked angry. Okay, I'll read it a second time for you. Suddenly, I saw a family of bears, a mother bear and 2 cubs, near the side of the road. I love bears. So I stopped the car, I got out, and I started taking photos. I wasn't very close to the bears, but the cubs got frightened and the mother looked angry. So once again, it's impossible to monitor this with 3,000 3,000 of you, but just to give you an idea, the summarizer might say, saw some bears, took some photographs, and my mother was very angry. The questioner might say, well, what's a cub? Wasn't the father with them? And the clarifier might say, a cub is a baby bear, and we don't know where the father was. And the predictor might say that the father will actually arrive at some point in order to help them. So what we've done in this particular, sorry, let me just show you, there's the second part, just so you can see what I read. Okay, so to summarize the activity, of course, the story goes on. I've only read you the first 2 parts just to give you an idea. And of course, you would probably normally do this using the audio, but you can read it. I guess nowadays, as we're all teaching online, it might be easier and more efficient for the teacher to read. It could also be a text from a course book. It doesn't necessarily have to be a listening activity, but it's important that we keep the 4 particular roles: the summarizing, the question, the clarifying, and the predicting, and bearing in mind that it's the students who are becoming the teachers. The teacher's job is basically to monitor what's going on within the groups. Now, I did notice somebody typed in the chat box a lot earlier, differentiation. Yeah, this activity is absolutely brilliant if you want to differentiate roles for students in the classroom. Those students who are particularly good at forming questions, they could be the ones asking the questions. I don't know, we don't need to answer my next question, but let's have a think about which of the 4 roles we feel would be the most challenging for students and the least challenging. Maybe the prediction is the least challenging, so maybe give that to the least able of your students in the group. I don't know, it depends on how you want to set it up. But this is a really great fun activity to use with students to promote fluent speaking, but let's also not forget that listening is very important. Which brings us to the last part of this webinar, which is this question: should students use any L1? L1 meaning obviously their first language, their home language, the language they probably learned before anything else. And I want to show you what David Atkinson said, that for many learners, and he says that in particular this is true for adults and teenagers, he says that if we occasionally use L1, or if they occasionally use L1, it gives them the opportunity to show that actually they are intelligent and maybe they have a degree of sophistication. In other words, if a student doesn't say anything because they're frightened, they're embarrassed, or they lack the language skills to speak in English, maybe just letting them use a little bit of L1 gives them the opportunity to communicate with us about something which could be particularly important to them. And he points out that if we are going to allow L1 in the classroom, first of all, we need to understand, of course, that it's an English language classroom. Therefore, what should we be using? We should be using English for the majority of the time. But there does need to be a balance. And he says that it depends on 4 different things. Definitely the students' previous learning experiences, where have they come from? Before they came to you, what was their experience in the classroom? Was it 100% immersion in English, or was some amount of first language allowed? What's their level? Where are we in the stage of the course? And indeed, where are we in the stage of the lesson? All of these things can have an impact on whether or not L1 is used in the classroom. Now, I know there are many arguments for and against using L1. We don't have the time now to discuss them. But let's just go on the side of, well, given that most of us are probably teaching in monolingual classrooms, I think there is probably a very strong argument that if you, the teacher, have knowledge of the student's L1, then possibly it could be used as an additional resource to help the flow of the lesson. And this lady here, which is not Penny Ur again, this is Jane Willis, and she says there are times when it's preferable and even more economical in terms of time to drop English for a few seconds. L1 is the student's first language. It's the language that the students use at home with their family. Now, I know there are many, there are lots of reasons why we shouldn't be using L1, but I think we're at a stage now in the development of language teaching where most of the experts do argue that actually using a little bit of L1 can be beneficial. But as I said, this is not time to go into that argument here. But Jane Willis says that we can use L1 to explain the meaning and the use of a new word. Now, I'm sure many of you are angry and thinking, yes, but we can use this, we can use Rayala, or you can use pictures, dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum. But, in terms of saving time, possibly a quick translation might actually be more efficient. Why not use it to explain the lesson names and the learning outcomes for the students? Trying to do that in English can actually take up an enormous amount of lesson time. Thirdly, maybe to check students' understanding of something. And the 4th thing that she mentions is maybe to summarize the main points or the main idea of something that the students have read. And I would add there that maybe something that the students have actually listened to. Going back to David Atkinson, he talks about having L1 problem clinics. And I think this is a really great idea, something that you can do during a lesson. You can actually have what he calls a problem clinic. This could be a timeout in the middle of the lesson. Maybe you can say to the students, right, for 5 minutes, we're going to have a problem clinic. It's a bit like going to the doctor with a problem, and you can explain to the doctor what your particular problem is with language. Or it could be something which happens after the lesson, where students are allowed to use their first language in order to discuss a potential problem with you. Another way of doing it, and I'm very guilty of this myself, is that we can use contrastive analysis, maybe encouraging students to use some L1 in a course book by saying to them, well, how do you say this in your language? And you can see an example on the screen now from one of my books. The English word is altitude. The grammatical form, it's a noun. There's an example sentence, but you'll see in the second column that it suggests that the students write a translation. And of course that will vary, depending on what the student's actual first language is. So the point I'm making here is that let's not completely remove L1 from our teaching contexts. Those of you that don't know the student's L1, it doesn't mean that L1 still can't be used as a resource in the speaking classroom. Okay, and that brings me to the end of what I wanted to talk to you about this morning, and I've just got a few conclusions to make. The first thing I want to say is that being competent in speaking, it's not so much about what we're talking about, it's very much about how we do it. And this takes us back to what we said earlier about fluency and accuracy. And I think very important to improving students' competence, it's all about actually building up their confidence. We talked last week in the first webinar, if you were able to be there, about taking risks and having challenges. And if students take risks and are successful, then of course their confidence is going to increase, improve, and that's a really essential part of the whole speaking process. Let's also not forget, and this is so obvious, but I think when we talk about speaking, we do forget, but let's not forget, of course, that listening is part of speaking. Let's integrate those two together. We saw the activity reciprocal speaking and listening, and that's a wonderful example of how we can reinforce the fact that listening and speaking are integrated. And a couple more points to make. Let's not sacrifice fluency for accuracy. In other words, let's encourage fluency. Let's not spend all our time focusing on accuracy. But of course, we can flip that round, and we can also say, don't sacrifice accuracy for fluency. And we've seen many of the experts saying during this webinar that both fluency and accuracy are important. Both are important if we want our students to be proficient speakers. And the very final thing I want to say today is that we need to scaffold, and scaffold again, and probably scaffold again and again and again, because the more scaffolding we provide, the more support we give our students, the more likely they are to become proficient or more proficient in spoken language. So thank you very much for being involved. Thank you very much for being here today. And apologies again that it wasn't the webinar that you were expecting, but I hope that you enjoyed it, you found it useful. And I think my colleague Matt in the Dubai office is going to handle any questions from you. Don't actually see him online at the moment.
Yep. No, I'm
he
back
is there.
here.
Yes, he's back. He's back. He's probably making bread or coffee or something.
It's just putting the pot on.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, we only have about 3 minutes left, Peter.
Okay.
So there's just been a lot of questions around tactics and methods to get students to not use L1 in class. If you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it goes back to many of the things that I've talked about this morning. I think number one, who is in the group? How did you allocate the students to the group? Was it random? U4, 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 or did you actually put some thought into who actually goes into the group? So I think that's the first thing. Who's in the group? Who's in the group? Do the students have any roles within the group? Is everybody expected to do the same thing? Or do individual members of the group have something individual that they have to do? In other words, the group needs to have a group role, a group outcome, but individuals within the group also need to have some sort of individual objective based on their particular role. Have you thought about the language which the students are using? How much support have you given them? How much teaching has gone on? What about the time that you've given the students? Is it too much time or is it too little time? I think all of these things are particularly important if we want to avoid students using L1 in the classroom. I think just to finish off this point, let's also remember that if you're teaching a monolingual group, asking a group of students whose first language may be Arabic or Turkish or whatever to do something in another language is very, very unrealistic, isn't it? We're actually asking the students to do something which is going to seem bizarre to them. So I think it's really important that we limit the time of these activities, keep them short, keep them at a challenge level which the students can achieve, and make sure they know the reason for the activity. I hope that answers the question.
I think that's great, Peter. So we're out of time, but just again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. I mean, 2,906 participants at the moment is just phenomenal. We still have a lot more interesting sessions coming up over the next week or 10 days. So please keep tuning in. Please ask your questions. I know that there's been a lot of chatter about certificates and things. I think the QR codes and the links that Roz will post, a way to get the certificates of attendance. But in general, come for the information, for the knowledge that you're getting here, and that's keeping us sustained through this period. So again, just thanks to Peter, thanks to Roz, thanks to everyone involved in this series, and we look forward to seeing you again on the next session.